Oké, collega's, ik denk... Kunnen jullie geluid van jullie laptops afzetten? Ik weet niet of dat het daar aan ligt, hè, maar... Oké, ik denk dat we kunnen starten. Ik wil voor eerst professor Enrico Spolaore van de Tufts University van hartelijk bedanken om hier aanwezig te willen zijn. Ik ga ervan uit dat u de vertaling krijgt in het Engels. Ja, maar bij mij staat het uit. Staat uit, hè?
Ja, nu is het goed. Kunnen jullie nog eens zitten?
Oké. Nee. Bij mij staat het volledig uit. Maar ik hoor nog ergens een echo. Oké. Nee. Het komt van daar ergens, denk ik. Als ik het goed kan horen, hè, maar... Alhoewel, nu is het ook daar. Of van bij de tolken, ik weet niet.
Ik hoor een echo hier, maar het staat, wie heeft gezien, het staat volledig af. Dat er is uit en op je hoofd staat. De meeste van de Misschien moet je dat even aan die prof zeggen.
Ja, professor, het spijt me, maar we hebben een klein beetje last van echo hier in de zaal. Dus we zullen nog een paar minuutjes moeten wachten. Is het klaar? Oké, we kunnen starten. Ah. We kunnen dus nog niet starten. Toontoelen, wie is dat?
Vertaler, de tolk. Die van de tolk.
Ah, oké.
Het toontoelen is een meerwerk.
Ah, oké.
Ja, toongevaart is een tolk. Sorry.
of hoe dat je hem zet. Ja. Ja, wat? Oh. Ja? Oké. Dus nogmaals, welkom, van harte welkom en bedankt om hier aanwezig te willen zijn. Professor Spolaore. En het is de bedoeling dat we een hoorzitting houden over de staatsstructuur en het toekomstig staatsmodel met u als enige spreker vandaag. Het is de bedoeling, als u zo vriendelijk zou willen zijn, om eerst een uiteenzetting te geven. Ik geef dan het woord aan de verschillende fracties, politieke fracties die hier aanwezig zijn. En dan kan u antwoorden in een eerste ronde op alle vragen. En desgevallend kunnen we dan ook nog eens een tweede ronde organiseren. Oké, dan geef ik u bij deze zeer graag het woord, professor.
So, is it my turn to speak? Yeah, sorry, my Dutch is not very good, but I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will share a few slides that I prepared. So I will. So I believe that, let's see, now you should be able to. See the slides from the start. Can you all see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So yeah, this is, now one would think that after almost 2 years on using Zoom for teaching, professors would be good at this. Although I'm glad to say that we have been teaching in person now since September at Tufts University, so we have not used Zoom for a while. Okay, so I titled this talk "Economic Research and the Formation and Redrawing of Political Borders," and so I would like to thank you for this opportunity to talk about this economic research on the formation and redrawing of political borders and territorial institutions. And I would like to say that in general, this research has focused on the interaction between political and economic factors that determine the formation and changes of borders and institutions at several levels. So at the national borders level, including the study of secessions and unifications, but also at the supranational level, in terms of supranational unions, such as the European Union. And in fact, there are very close connections between the design of states and national borders at the national level and at the supranational level. And of course, this is particularly relevant for the countries of the European Union, but also the subnational units. When we talk about federalism, decentralization, and I know how much work in the past decades has been done in Belgium in the design of regions and communities and federal structure. So in this brief presentation, I do not plan to provide specific comments or recommendations about the specifics of state reform in Belgium, because this is not my area of expertise. I've not done any specific work directly on Belgium or on the current debate. My understanding is that I'm here to provide a broader overview of the economic approach and the economic ideas, the tools to these topics from my own perspective, as a political economist. So the motivation for this research comes from several sources. Of course, in the longer run, we have seen that the formation and breakup of sovereign states and other territorial units has been at the center of history for thousands of years. Of course, states are the most important institutions, for most of recent human history, at least. However, in recent decades, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of independent states and the spreading of demand for autonomy, for independence. And this trend has renewed an interest in the redrawing of national and subnational borders. And if you consider that in the 1945, there were, depending on how you count, about 74 independent countries, and only 51 were members of the United Nations. And now the United Nations has 193 members. So there's been this explosion in the number of independent, of sovereign states in the world. In this map, you can see how the different process, of course, the breakup of the big colonial empires, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the all sort of creation of new states in Eastern Europe, Central Europe has, but also in other parts of the world have led to this large increase in the number of countries. Now, traditionally, these issues about the size of political communities, what would be the optimal size, what would be the implications, they have been addressed mainly by philosophers and historians. So here I have a couple of quotes just to give an idea of the kind of ideas that philosophers use when studying the size of nations. Aristotle said, "Experience has shown that it is difficult, if not impossible, for a populous state to be run by good laws," which is quite ironic considering that Aristotle's most famous student was Alexander the Great, that eventually conquered a very large and populous state. But of course, for Aristotle, it was very important to have countries. I mean, in this way, was city-states that would be closer to the preferences of people that were running the state, and which is an idea that also emerged again in the 18th century with Montesquieu, the famous philosopher who is also sort of the inventor of the modern concept of checks and balances. And he wrote, "In a small republic, the public good is more strongly felt, better known, and closer to each citizen." So this is an idea that, as we will see, has become important in the economic analysis of nation states. The fact that the public good is closer to the preferences of the citizens, typically when we have a smaller size or less heterogeneous communities. Now, here is a quote that I like also because this is by an Italian philosopher of the 18th century, Cesare Beccaria. "To the extent that society increases, each member becomes a smaller part of the whole, and the Republican sentiment becomes proportionally smaller if the laws do not take care to reinforce it. A republic that is too vast cannot save itself from despotism except by subdividing itself and uniting itself into so many federative republics." So this is an idea connecting the size and the organization of the state, both to of how close the sense of civicness of Republican sentiment is, and also to democracy, the importance of democracy. This is a very strong connection between the ability to have democratic decisions and the extent that these democratic decisions are taken, in larger or smaller units. So this whole research now was mainly, as I said, informal by political scientists, by historians, by philosophers. Now, more recently, economists have started to study the formation and breakup of sovereign states and political unions from an economic perspective. And I say more recently, but of course now I would have to say also as I become older that this is now has happened, start at least since the early 90s and in the past 2 or 3 decades. The focus has been on the cost and benefits of political units of different size. But of course, this doesn't mean that it's a purely economic analysis. In fact, one of the major innovations of political economy is to bring together economic factors with political and cultural factors. But also a large part of this research is also about measuring political and cultural variables and inserting them into the analysis. So with the rigorous tools of economics. So this, of course, I apologize a little bit for, the self, serving propaganda here, but as I said, I'm going to present it from my point of view. So based on the research that I did with my co-authors, a major part of what I have done in the past few years was done with Alberto Alesina, and in particular we wrote a book titled "The Size of Nations" that came out now several years ago. I'm pleased that it's still of interest, as just last year there was a Chinese translation so here you can see here on the right that this is the Chinese translation that just came out last year, and it has been translated in other languages. Now, very sadly, Alberto Alesina, my co-author, my friend, passed prematurely 2 years ago in 2020 at the age of 63. So he's not among us, unfortunately, to comment and to continue to contribute to this literature that, of course, he was one of the pioneers in this literature, as well as in general in the fields of political economy, and in particular in this field that links political and economic variables to culture, to cultural variables, to culture, to language, to values, to beliefs. So this is being a very big part, was a very big part of his research. Now, I have a few references here. Of course, I will make these slides available to anybody who is interested. I have a few more recent references, so of course it doesn't have to read, the whole book. So a few years ago, Alberto Alesina and I wrote this shorter article titled "What's Happening with the Number and Size of Nations for International Relations," which was a sort of an overview of this research, and also how this research continues to be very relevant for what's going on in the world. Of course, at the time, there was already been a referendum in Scotland. There was all the debate in Catalonia, and Brexit is also part of this debate, of course, because Brexit is a breakup from a supranational union, but many of the concepts, of course, apply also to the cost and benefits of Brexit and the consequences of Brexit. So this was all. So this is a more recent article, although already written a few years ago. And then I recently also wrote about the political economy of European integration, and what is European integration really about. So these are this is also very relevant for many of the issues that have to do with size of nations and size and political borders. And I have also this other paper that I think is more relevant in the Belgian context, perhaps, about federalism, regional redistribution, and country stability. So these are a few references. Now, the key trade-off that we have studied in economics that is relevant to understand how borders are determined in practice, and also from a more normative perspective, how they should be determined if we care about efficiency, stability, optimality. The key trade-off is between, on the one side, public goods, legal systems, education, public health, defense and security, the common currency. They come with economies of scale. There might be benefits from a larger size, typically because the cost could be shared among a larger population very often. There are also economies of scope very often that are important. It may be cheaper to provide several public goods together rather than separately. This has been an important debate about the common currency. Is it okay to provide to have the euro without other forms of integration, fiscal integration, political integration? That has been, of course, very controversial. So there are these economies of scale and economies of scope. Now, very often, economists, only emphasize the economies of scale and the economies of scope, but that would just lead us to say, bigger, bigger, bigger is always better. But of course, this in practice, then we see that this is not the case, that in fact, very often, larger units might not be efficient or might be unstable. And the reason is because we have another side of the trade-off, which are the costs that have to be traded against these benefits, which are what we call the cost of heterogeneity, of the fact that there might be different preferences for public policies in larger and more diverse populations. And now we have to be careful here about when we talk about heterogeneity, because heterogeneity is a very broad concept, and in general it means that there are differences of all sorts within a population. But now these differences can come with cost and benefits in general. So, but there is a key distinction that has to be made, which I think was not clear, I think, in the literature, although it should have been, but I think more recent work has made it much more clear, and I have a few references, just an example here. The distinction is between public goods and rival goods, what in economics we call rival goods. Now, a public good is a good that once you have it, once you provide it, has to be shared among everybody within, you know, the community that enjoys the public good. But if I consume that public good, I don't necessarily reduce your use of the public good. So, you know, if we have a, you know, a legal system, if I benefit from the protection of the legal system, everybody else also benefits from the protection of that legal system. A rival good is a good that if I consume it, other people cannot consume it, you know, like a sandwich, you know, or a bottle of wine. If I drink the whole wine, you know, other people cannot drink the wine. So that is what rival goods are. Now, heterogeneous preferences negatively affect the provision of public goods, which are non-rival in consumption, but then they must be shared by all within a jurisdiction, whether one likes them or not. You know, even within a household, within a family, you know, if you are watching television with your family and, you know, your kids, your relatives, that at that moment is a public good. It says everybody has to share the same show, but then it's good if we all have the same taste. If we say we want all to watch the same show, maybe in the same language, covering the same material. But if one wants to watch the football match and the other wants to watch, you know, the opera, you know, there would be conflict, and somebody has to suffer, somebody has to give away. So in that sense, public goods are negatively affected by heterogeneity. Now, the opposite is true for rival goods, because they come with benefits. You know, when considering the heterogeneity comes with benefits. You know, if we have a different taste and we come with different sandwiches, and some are with ham and some are vegetarian and some are with some other, you know, with chicken, the fact that different people have different tastes is good, because then they will not fight over the same sandwich, but they will end up, you know, getting whatever they like. And this has been shown that, you know, when we have dealings, interactions about rival goods, so, you know, and this is true in trade, for example, when we trade with each other. In fact, the whole theory of trade shows that there are gains from trade coming from diversity and different preferences, different productivities, relative productivities, different factor endowments, different tastes. Those are all leading to gains from trade. But this is also true when we talk about conflict. And in fact, we are seeing that right now, you know, in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, some of the conflict, for example, already the occupation of Crimea, for example, took place because Crimea, both the Russians and people from Ukraine, they both care about Crimea a lot. If you read what Putin wrote about Crimea, because of the common history and so on. And of course, that doesn't justify at all the conflict. In fact, very often the reason why there is a conflict is because there is a Leviathan, there is a powerful entity like Russia historically that wants to conquer other territories. But very often the territories that are conquered, that are in the interest of the Leviathan to conquer, are those that are closer linguistically or religiously to the center, because that reduces the cost. So very often you have that international conflict, something that we studied myself with my co-author Roman Waxiark in War and Relatedness in the Review of Economics and Statistics. We saw that very often international conflicts takes place between countries that are more similar to themselves in culture and history and language, rather than more different. So that's a very important difference. But when we think about the size of nation, very often the fact that public goods within the country, you know, tend to be negatively affected by heterogeneity is a very important determinant. So now the issue is, what are the potential sources of heterogeneous preferences? And here there has been study that has used religious distance, especially it's very more important historically over in the past. These days, of course, linguistic distance is very important. And of course, we know in Belgium how important linguistic difference is. have been in recent history, over the past 200 years of history of the country. And cultural distance can be measured also directly. People can be asked about their values, their beliefs, and then we can measure how different populations might differ or be more similar about cultural distance. Of course, there are correlations across these different variables and, that have been studied in the literature. So here is a map of the ancestral languages of Europe, the different families. Of course, you have the Germanic family here in reddish, and the Romance family coming from Latin and Slavic and so on. And in fact, in my work with Roman Waxiarg, we have, for each region of Europe, we have determined what was the ancestral language, the language that was spoken in the region, let's say, before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then studied the linguistic distance across all these different regions, which is very important and to explain all sorts of changes that took place in terms of the timing and the changes that took place over the past 200 years, the spread of modernity, the change in fertility behavior, and so on. So now, of course, in the case of Belgium, we know that there is a very, that's where, the border between the Romance languages and the Germanic languages is so that, and the other, as you can see, also very different dialects of Dutch that are measured, that can be measured directly. These are the ancestral languages. So, what are the implications when we think about more practically? Of course, you have, practical issues that you have to decide, at what level, regional or national or subnational, different functions and different policies have to be delegated, have to be, where the ultimate power, where it has to be placed. And here is a very simple scheme that just to fix ideas. Of course, in reality, both the heterogeneity cost and the economies of scale work along a continuum. But here, just to fix ideas, I wrote 4 boxes, considering, at one extreme, suppose that you have very low heterogeneity costs. People pretty much kind of agree within a community about, even relatively what should be done about those public policies, but also relatively lower economies of scale. It doesn't really pay much to do it, big. Then a lot of this is done at regional and municipal level, especially at the municipal level. If these are either rival goods or less controversial public goods, like water, garbage collection, and so on. Although it might become contentious in some cases, even this. But let's say relatively. But now, if there are very high economies of scale, it's at low heterogeneity cost or heterogeneity benefits, this is really worth doing at a very, very broad level. And commercial integration. That's why the European Union, when was a European community focused on trade, there was a big success, I think, overall. Personally, I'm a fan of European integration overall. I'm not at all against European integration, but I thought that, it was especially successful when it was done over trade and commercial integration. And in the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, it became more contentious as, moving towards issues about the common currency or, fiscal union and so on, where we are in this other box where we have higher economies of scale and higher heterogeneity costs, when there are different communities that think differently in terms of what would be the appropriate policies. Then the fundamental policy involving sovereignty and monopoly of legal coercion, fiscal union, common defense, a full political union, that's where we have the big dilemma, where we don't really know if they should be done at the national, subnational, supranational level, because we have, in the trade-off, we have both higher heterogeneity cost and potentially higher economies of scale. Now, of course, if there are lower economies of scale and there are higher heterogeneity costs, a lot of cultural issues and also some economic issues, then it makes a lot of sense to do it at the subnational level, at the federal level, at the regional level. And that's why I'm also a big fan of decentralization and autonomy. And I think that also gives a much more democratic approach. So in that sense, Montesquieu was right, I think, and Beccaria were right, that those are public goods that get closer to the preferences of the people. So now, I don't know how much time I've left. I don't want to take too much time with this presentation, so I will be quick here, and I apologize if I'm too fast, but I can respond questions. I can answer a question later if you have questions about this. Now, a very important part of the research on the economic approach to these issues is that both the benefits of scale and partly also the heterogeneity costs, but mainly the benefits of scale, very much change depending on the role of the international environment, both economic and political. So the benefits of a larger size depend on the international economic and political environment. And so it's very, very important to have, to have a larger country, all other things being equal. If you have very high trade barriers, it's very high to trade with the rest of the world. Imagine if, Belgium were unable to trade with France, with Germany, or with Italy, or with the rest of the European Union, or overseas. Of course, then it would be a very different story, because then we would say, well, it's very important to have a domestic market. Now, if there is free trade, typically it's not as important. It's not as valuable to have a large domestic market. This is something that has been shown in the data. And now, of course, if there is also a lot of international conflict and weak military alliances, you need to have a large state. The union makes strength. But if the military alliances are strong and if there is a more peaceful setting international relations, then smaller countries can survive much more efficiently. And of course, we see this right now as we have an international crisis, and we will have to see to what extent the military alliance, NATO is effective, and to what, because of course you can imagine that things would go very differently if we live in a more bellicose world. But a major reason why in the past few decades overall there has been a big increase in the number of nations is because on balance there is being an increase in economic integration, and also there was an end to the Cold War, of course. But whether these trends will continue, there's been also a big question, about what is the relationship between economic integration and political disintegration. By political disintegration, I mean secessions, but also it could be more federalism up to a point. I mean, it's disintegration, in a better sense, in a sense that there is being a decentralization of functions within countries. So if we think about political disintegration as going towards smaller units or whatever type, economic integration enforces that, because as international economic integration increases, the economic cost of being smaller reduce, and as political disintegration becomes less expensive from an economic perspective. So in a word, it's also true that in a world of smaller countries, international openness is more important. Now, there's been a lot of debate whether the COVID crisis, the pandemic has, led us to more or less globalization and integration. And especially at the beginning, if you read what people were writing in 2020, there was a sense that maybe we will go towards more localism or less global trade. That doesn't quite happen. Of course, there has been disruptions, supply chain disruptions and so on. But overall, the international economy has remained quite open, maybe quite surprisingly. The goods and services have continued to be traded. So it doesn't look like, we are going back towards a world of very high barriers to trade. But certainly there is a push towards more protectionism, which I personally think it's a bad thing overall, for, as most economists do, for the economy. So clearly openness, international openness at the economic level, I think would be good for many reasons per se, but would also allow, more democratic organization of political borders, in my view. And now there is another issue, which is whether, in order to keep countries together, some people say, can one reorganize taxes and transfer? This I've done, some work on this, and the big issue here is the heterogeneity costs are based on preferences, different about languages, culture, and so on, not about differences in income necessarily. So from an optimality point of view, in order to keep countries together, if that is the objective, one should change taxes and transfer based on preferences. So the regions which are politically and culturally farther from the center should pay lower taxes. And very often that becomes not feasible politically or even constitutionally sometimes, because it's not necessarily the case that the regions that are farther culturally or politically from the center, they are poorer. Sometimes they are richer. And so that there is this difference between income-based tax and transfer schemes, which are the way that most countries organize the tax and transfer, and what would be optimal from the point of view of the design of political borders. So this also has been studied in this literature. So the final thing that I want to say is that I'm a big fan, especially of democracy. I think that's very important that borders should be supported by their populations. And we have seen that if borders are not supported by their population, typically they are not stable in the long run in the democratic setting, if there, especially if there's a lot of heterogeneity of preferences, unless that heterogeneity is suppressed by force. So that very often happen by big empires or kings or rulers. So that's how in the past you had big heterogeneous empires. But these days, we believe that should be people that vote. Of course, people have different interests about this. I'm also not in the view that there is something like the people and everybody thinks the same. Different people think different ways. So there are three possible mechanisms in principle that have been studied in political economy in a democratic system. And one which is probably one of the most important is the decentralization of functions in public policies done democratically. And I certainly think that's exactly, I believe, what you are doing in the Flemish Parliament and what is going on in Belgium for a while. The study to approach this idea of decentralizing functions and public policies at the more regional level or at the more, the level of linguistic cultural communities, as it happened, especially at the beginning, and then later there's been a whole organization of functions along subnational units. So that's one way that in general can be very effective. But of course, then there is the issue of where to stop and so on. But here, think about these trade-offs between economies of scale and scope on one side and heterogeneity costs from the other is very helpful to understand how to organize different functions and how they are also connected at the supranational level with the European Union. That's also a very important thing. Many things might not need to be done at the national level anymore because the European Union can take care of that. But that's a big question, up to what point the European Union can be rely on for some of the bigger functions. So that's one point. Then there is the renegotiation of taxes and transfers towards a preference-based system, which is much harder to do, and that there are issues of feasibility and credibility, but occasionally it can be done up to a point. And then there is the voting over borders. I think I believe that it's good to let people also vote. I thought it was a good idea that for the British government to ask the Scots about their borders rather than even though politically might have been extremely dangerous from the point of view of the Prime Minister at the time. And in general, voting over borders is something that could be, shouldn't be completely considered a no. Of course, it has to be done peacefully and consensually and with everybody on board. It shouldn't be done unilaterally, though. I mean, of course, I'm very much for, peaceful and democratic and consensual way of doing things. And so that's end my presentation. And I would like to thank you for this. Thank you, I guess. That's and also happy Valentine's Day to everybody. As today is also Valentine's Day, I saw a nice balloon with the heart in the room. So, and if you have any questions, of course, I'll be more than happy to answer them. And maybe I should stop sharing my screen.
Oké, hartelijk bedankt, professor Spolahoe. Ik ga nu alle fracties... Hoort u mij? Ik denk dat niet, eerlijk gezegd. Professor, hoorde mij? Die hoort mij niet, denk ik. U hoort mij. You hear me in Dutch, but not in English.
I don't hear you I don't have a connection to an interpreter, so I can
No,
hear you
but we have them here, so there's a little technical problem, I think.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't understand Dutch. So if you ask me a question, or in Italian, if you want, I'll be happy to take a question in Italian or in Portuguese.
No, wij wel. So now it's the meaning that each political party present here is going to ask some questions to you. And the first speaker already, Karel, are you going to speak in English or?
prefer in Dutch. Maar mag ik iets uitleggen in het Engels? Dat hij het verstaat?
Yeah. So first I give the word to the NVA fraction. It's Karel van Lauw, I suppose.
Professor, probably you hear me in English, but there is a possibility for you. Under the screen, you'll see interpretation, and you can put it on English or on Dutch. It's under at your right side. You'll see raise hand, record, and then you see probably interpretation.
Yes.
And if you put,
Yes,
that's off English
yeah,
or
click
Dutch.
English, no, thank you. Yes, I click on English now, yes.
Okay, then I can speak Dutch. Ik zal Nederlands spreken en dan zou je mij moeten verstaan. Heeft u mij
Yes, I
verstaan?
can hear you. Thank you very much. Great.
Oké,
Thanks.
ja. Dank u wel, professor Spolaore. Dus ik hoop dat u mij nu goed verstaat, dat er ook vertaling is naar het Engels. Ik wil u heel uitdrukkelijk bedanken voor uw zeer boeiende toespraak. Ik heb ook reeds de eer gehad u ooit eens te kunnen ontmoeten, een jaar of 10, 15 geleden, toen u in het land was en ook gesproken hebt over uw boek The Size of Nations. Het was bijzonder boeiend en interessant. U hebt inderdaad gezegd, u bent geen specialist in Belgische politiek. U weet vanuit onze werkgroep, of u weet dat misschien niet, maar de bedoeling is dat wij debatteren met verschillende partijen binnen het Vlaams parlement om te zien waar de knelpunten, de problemen zijn in ons land. En het is zeer interessant dat u uw visie met ons gedeeld hebt desbetreffend. Ongetwijfeld zal u weten dat België ontstaan in 1830, wat mij betreft een grote historische fout in de geschiedenis. Maar dat had natuurlijk te maken met taalkundige, culturele, religieuze aspecten. Wij zijn uiteraard geëvolueerd en we zien natuurlijk dat het nu economisch relevanter is geworden en misschien minder op taalkundige of culturele of identiteit. Die complexiteit van ons land die zorgt er eigenlijk op dit ogenblik een beetje voor dat ons land wat geblokkeerd is. Wat, dan bedoel ik eigenlijk, dat is een eufemisme om te zeggen dat ons land op vele domeinen toch enorm geblokkeerd is. Wat ik heel belangrijk vond in uw tussenkomst is dat u zegt dat in deze tijden er eigenlijk sinds 1945 verschillende onafhankelijke landen zijn bijgekomen. Ik dacht dat het gegaan is van 71 naar 195, of dat er nu 195 leden zijn van de Verenigde Naties. We hebben dat uiteraard gezien met de dekolonisatie. Uiteraard, niemand gaat dat betwisten, het uiteenvallen van de Sovjet-Unie. Maar zelf ook binnen Europa zijn er landen bijgekomen. Tsjechië en Slowakije zijn uiteengevallen. We hebben natuurlijk het conflict in Joegoslavië gezien. Maar er zijn heel wat landen binnen Europa bijgekomen, waarvan sommige ondertussen ook lid geworden zijn van de Europese Unie. Dus we zien eigenlijk wel in een geglobaliseerde wereld dat er meer landen bijkomen dan dat er landen verdwijnen. Ik dacht het laatste dat erbij gekomen is Zuid-Soedan wereldwijd. Dat is volgens mij het laatste land dat is toegetreden tot de Verenigde Naties. Verder zijn er nog uiteraard heel wat andere. Ik ga u een paar vragen stellen. U mag daar uiteraard op antwoorden vanuit uw economische visie. Welke bevoegdheden moeten, hoe dan ook, centraal of federaal worden uitgeoefend om toch van één land te kunnen spreken? Dus op welke manier kunnen eigenlijk bevoegdheden overgedragen worden, gedecentraliseerd dan? Maar welke bevoegdheden? Bij ons zegt men soms, dat moet ook defensie zijn, of dat moet een buitenlands beleid zijn, dat kunnen nog andere zaken zijn. Maar wat is volgens u als economist, specialist in, ik mag niet zeggen economisch separatisme, maar toch als specialist, om eigenlijk te zeggen, een land is één wanneer die bevoegdheden op het centraal unitaire niveau worden uitgeoefend. Een tweede discussiepunt, en dat is weer vooral Belgisch. Wij zitten met eigenlijk het probleem van bevoegdheden die verdeeld zijn. Om het heel eenvoudig voor u, soms hebben we wat concurrerende bevoegdheden. Bevoegdheden die gedeeltelijk gedecentraliseerd zijn en andere bevoegdheden die nog federaal worden uitgeoefend, waardoor er heel wat bevoegdheidsconflicten ontstaan. En mijn vraag is dan ook, hoe belangrijk zijn die homogene bevoegdheden en dus exclusieve bevoegdheden voor ofwel die centrale staat ofwel voor die deelstaten om echt te kunnen spreken van een goed functionerend land. En dan een verdere vraag. U hebt ongetwijfeld het debat gevolgd in ons land met betrekking tot het CETA-handelsverdrag, waarbij de Europese Unie een handelsverdrag afsloot met Canada en waarbij eigenlijk Europa quasi iedereen mee akkoord was van de lidstaten. Ook in Vlaanderen was men absoluut voorstander van dat handelsverdrag, maar onze Waalse buren en vrienden waren eerder tegenstander van dat verdrag en hebben dat enige tijd toch wel geblokkeerd. Ziet u daar ergens een tendens dat bijvoorbeeld kleinere deelstaten, regio's of die economisch zwakker staan, dat die absoluut tegenstander zijn van meer autonomie ten aanzien en dus eigenlijk eerder in een groter geheel, in een unie, in een samenwerking, in een gecentraliseerde staat zouden verkiezen. En tenslotte een laatste vraag. Kent u ook voorbeelden van goed bestuurde, grote, heterogene landen? Is dat bijvoorbeeld de Verenigde Staten, waar u ongetwijfeld meer ervaring ook mee hebt? Of zijn er andere voorbeelden van? Ik weet, mevrouw de voorzitter, dat er nog vragen zijn van andere fractieleden, maar dat laat ik aan u over.
Collega Van Dijk of collega Koel? Hebt u nog bijkomende vragen? Collega Koel.
Ja, dank u, voorzitter.
Should I answer the questions now or should I wait for additional questions?
Ik denk dat we best alle vragen eerst doen en dat u dan antwoordt, als dat goed is voor u. Oké, fijn.
Ja, dank u, voorzitter. Dank u, professor, voor uw presentatie. U heeft het in uw presentatie ook gehad over de optimale belastingen, of het niveau van belastingen en transfers tussen regio's om landen bijeen te houden of om drijfveer te zijn om meer autonomie op te zoeken. U geeft daaraan dat het vooral op voorkeuren gebaseerd moet zijn om die heterogeniteit maximaal te respecteren, maar dat het in de meeste gevallen op inkomen gebaseerd is en dat dat eerder een drijfveer is om dan meer autonomie op te zoeken, omdat rijkere regio's die dus netto betaler zijn in een natie die bestaat uit verschillende deelstaten, dat die dan de incentive hebben om eigenlijk meer autonomie op te zoeken, zodat ze die transfers niet meer moeten betalen. Dus u geeft anderzijds in uw presentatie aan dat ook kleine landen er soms voordeel bij hebben om meer autonomie na te streven als ze dan bepaalde slagkracht kunnen ontwikkelen. Natuurlijk, voor de rijkere regio's lijkt dat evident, maar voor de armere regio's die overblijven of die verlaten worden of die bedreigd worden met afscheiding van de rijkere regio, wat zijn daar vanuit uw economisch perspectief of onderzoek argumenten om te zeggen dat ook zij er voordeel kunnen bij hebben om op eigen benen te staan? Of welke garanties moeten er daarbij ingebouwd worden, opdat zij maximaal kans hebben om eenmaal verplicht dan op eigen benen maximaal slaagkans te hebben om dat ook succesvol te doen? In verschillende federale of confederale staten zijn er financieringswetten die budgetstromen vormgeven om een bepaalde vorm van solidariteit eigenlijk vast te leggen. Vanuit uw economische achtergrond, wat is daar een goed overgangsmechanisme, eenmaal zo'n federale staat de deelstaten meer autonomie geeft? Wat is een gerechtvaardigde periode om zo'n solidariteitsmechanisme aan te houden? Enerzijds om die armere regio's voldoende slaagkans te geven. Anderzijds, als je ze te lang laat genieten, bij wijze van spreken, van het solidariteitsmechanisme, is dat dan geen incentive om eigenlijk te weinig werk te maken van eigen ontplooiing, eigen ontwikkeling. Dan een vraagje over de manier van belastingen voeren in federale staten. Een eerdere econoom in deze zitting, Geert Jennes van WIZ, die gaf aan dat fiscale concurrentie essentieel is in een federale staat om voldoende economische dynamiek tussen de deelstaten te laten plaatsvinden. En hij gaf aan dat fiscaliteit best op een zo laag mogelijk niveau georganiseerd wordt, dus best op niveau van de deelstaten, niet zozeer op niveau van de centrale of van de federale staat. In België is het eigenlijk anders georganiseerd. Daar werkt men voornamelijk met belastingen op het nationale niveau en zijn er dotaties naar de regio's. Kan u daar een beoordeling van geven van wat volgens u het meest wenselijke systeem is vanuit economisch perspectief? Dat dotatiefederalisme of werken met een zo groot mogelijke vorm van fiscale autonomie? En dan misschien ook nog een vraagje over staatsschuld. Dus landen met een groot opgebouwde staatsschuld, als er dan tendensen zijn om naar meer autonomie te gaan, wat zijn dan gebruikelijk parameters om zo'n staatsschuld, om daarmee om te gaan bij een eventuele verdere opdeling van zo'n staat? En dan tot slot vanuit het Europees perspectief. Dus u geeft aan dat een voorwaarde voor een klein land om succesvol een autonomie na te streven, dat is dat het in een sfeer van vrede, dus, dus niet bedreigd wordt door oorlog, dus in een groter verband. En langs de ene kant en de andere kant dat het via vrijhandel voldoende toegang heeft tot een markt die groot genoeg is om economisch succesvol te zijn. Dus ik neem aan dat dat een argument pro is voor deelstaten binnen een lidstaat van de Europese Unie om meer autonomie na te streven, of om succesvol autonomie te kunnen nastreven, omdat zij juist in dat Europees verband reeds actief zijn. Anderzijds zien we natuurlijk dat de Europese Unie ondertussen naast een economische unie toch ook wel is uitgegroeid tot een fiscale unie, zelfs een politieke unie, die ook heel wat verder gaat dan puur de vrijhandelszone. Kan u daar misschien nog wat duiding over geven in hoeverre het dan zinvol is om voor een deelstaat tot meer autonomie over te gaan als zij dan vervolgens toch gebonden is aan een aantal supranationale structuren waar de lidstaat, waar zij van afscheidt, al zich toe geëngageerd had. Dank u.
Dank u wel, collega Koel. Dan geef ik graag het woord aan collega Van Dijk.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Dank u wel. Ik zou zeggen, goedemorgen, professor Spolaore. Wij zijn al een stukje in de namiddag. Maar voor eerst hartelijk dank. Ik heb jaren geleden ook kennis kunnen maken en uw boek met zeer veel interesse gelezen, met name The Size of Nations. En als men mij nu, zoveel jaren later, vraagt wat is de essentie van dat boek, en ik leg het u even voor, dan is dat voor mij dat vroeger landen groot moesten zijn om grondstoffen te hebben, om arbeidskrachten te hebben, om afzetgebied te hebben, terwijl we nu kleinere staten nodig hebben, in een wereldeconomie met heel veel vrijhandel, waarbij er kort op de bal moet kunnen gespeeld worden en waarbij je op een flexibele manier met de toekomst moet kunnen omgaan. En als u kunt zeggen, meneer Van Dijk, u hebt mijn boek gesnapt, dan ben ik een tevreden man. Maar ik zie nog geen reactie. Nee, maar mijn collega en u daar straks in uw uiteenzetting hebt gesproken over het aantal staten. Ik denk dat het duidelijk is dat geen enkele staat met een andere te vergelijken is. Maar wat voor ons hier toch wel heel belangrijk is dat binnen die staten je kan spreken van heterogene staten en van homogene staten. En die heterogene staten die wil ik dan nog eens opdelen in twee aparte blokken. Enerzijds heterogene staten die sterk centralistisch aangestuurd worden en anderzijds heterogene staten waarbij toch een vorm van autonomie bestaat voor de deelentiteiten, al dan niet naties kunnen genoemd worden. Nu, mijn vraag, ik heb een paar vragen voor u. Voor eerst, in hoeverre u beschrijft dat decentralisatie van een heterogene staat dan, dat die zowel tot stabiliteit kan teweegbrengen, dan wel het aanwakkeren van meer autonomiestreven. Ik zou dat bijna kunnen vergelijken met wat in Groot-Brittannië afspeelt met de devolution. Maar in ieder geval, mijn vraag is aan u, waar ligt die césuur tussen dat het enerzijds stabiliserend werkt, dan wel meer autonomiestreven creëert? Dus zijn er een aantal parameters waarbij je kan zeggen, in dat geval zal het eerder die richting uitgaan dan het andere? Een voorbeeld dat ik ook heel graag zie hier in Europa van een sterk gedecentraliseerde staat met toch eigenlijk een zekere homogeniteit, omdat ze samen willen werken, dat is denk ik het Zwitsers model. En we hebben deze week of dit weekend nog ervaren dat met een referendum in Zwitserland, dat eigenlijk het volk zienswijze van het parlement naast zich neerlegt. Het ging dan over de reclame op tabak. Maar mijn vraag is, in hoeverre kunnen burgerparticipaties al dan niet stimulerend zijn om een cohesie binnen een staat, binnen een land teweeg te brengen? En ligt daar ook enige césuur? Ik vind het enerzijds vreemd dat het Zwitsers model wat dat betreft heel sterk werkt, terwijl het anderzijds toch wel en op taal en op culturaliteit een zeer divers land is. Ik heb u nog een vraagje te stellen in verband met... even mijn blad omdraaien, wat ik daar straks opgeschreven had. Wanneer het gaat over nationale minderheden in multinationale staten. België is er zo een. We zijn geen groot land, maar we zijn een land toch met een aantal minderheden, vooral taalkundige minderheden dan. Nu, in dit land zijn er heel wat automatismen ingebouwd om eigenlijk niet alleen de rechten van de minderheden te garanderen, maar eigenlijk die minderheden, ja, ik durf het woord te gebruiken, te gaan beschermen. En ook daar toch wel de vraag, in hoeverre kunnen die beschermende maatregelen, hoe ver kun je daarin gaan om, en dat is misschien voor u als econoom niet eenvoudig om daarop te antwoorden, maar toch, ik leg het u voor, hoe ver kan je daarin gaan om anderzijds toch een aantal democratische principes overeind te houden dat een meerderheid een beslissing kan nemen. Dus in België en in zonder voor bijzondere wetten is er een zeer stringente regelgeving waarbij een minderheid toch vrij snel over een blokkering kan beschikken. Tot daar in eerste ronde mijn vragen en ik dank u nogmaals voor uw bijdrage aan ons debat. Dank u wel.
Dank u wel, collega Van Dijk. Dan is het woord nu aan collega Beks.
Dank u wel, professor, voor uw uiteenzetting, die zeer helder was. Voornamelijk wel theoretisch natuurlijk en misschien niet meteen duidelijk wat het juist betekent voor de specifieke Belgische context. En in dat opzicht wou ik u een aantal elementen voorleggen. Laat mij beginnen met te zeggen dat ik eigenlijk denk dat moest België een land zijn met een aantal regio's die geografisch heel duidelijk en sterk van elkaar afgebakend waren, dat er waarschijnlijk al lang een meer verregaande autonomie voor de deelstaten zou bestaan. Maar België bestaat uit twee landsdelen die als een Siamese tweeling aan de kop te samenhangen met de hoofdstad Brussel, die tweetalig is. En ja, dat hangt allemaal zeer sterk aan elkaar. Dat is een metropolitane gemeenschap die veel groter is dan de grenzen van de officiële deelstaat, het Brussels hoofdstedelijk gewest. En dan vraag ik mij af of vanuit de theoretische bevindingen die u vandaag met ons deelt, of u daar ook kunt van zeggen of wat daarvan de repercussies zijn op een dusdanig sterk verwevenheid, zowel op het gebied van economie als op het gebied van stedelijk weefsel, waar je echt niet merkt wanneer je uit de ene deelstaat rijdt en in de andere deelstaat binnenrijdt, als ook op het vlak van taalheterogeniteit. We hadden vroeger laten we zeggen, een grote Franstalige meerderheid in het Brusselse gewest tegenover een kleine Nederlandstalige minderheid. De grenzen zijn dan duidelijk afgebakend om te zeggen, kijk, die Franstalige invloeden die mogen niet verder gaan dan die gewestgrenzen. Dat was in de jaren 70 van de vorige eeuw. Maar intussen heb je natuurlijk demografische evoluties gehad die maken dat in de rand rond Brussel steeds meer en meer Franstaligen zijn gaan wonen. Dat wordt dus, met andere woorden, al bij al steeds meer moeilijk om daar duidelijk te zeggen, kijk, dat is een duidelijk heterogeen gebied versus het andere. En mijn vraag spitst zich eigenlijk toe op dat ene aspect. Hoe kunnen uw theorieën, waarvan ik geloof dat ze zeker gelden in een land dat bijvoorbeeld zeer heterogeen is samengesteld en waar die heterogeniteit ook zeer duidelijk geografisch afgebakend is, hoe is dat toepasbaar op een zeer klein land waar dat eigenlijk rond de hoofdstad allemaal zeer gemengd en door elkaar loopt?
Dank u wel, collega Beks. En dan graag het woord aan collega Genet.
Ja, dank u wel, professor, ook van onze kant namens de Sociaal-Democratische fractie voor uw uitgebreide toelichting. Eigenlijk bent u waarschijnlijk al heel uw carrière op zoek naar de ideale scope en size van een land en de bestuurskracht om de burgers de preferenties te laten goedkomen en de link tussen die twee. En als ik u goed begrepen heb, dan zegt u van ja, eigenlijk ligt het snijpunt daar waar de hoge kost door een verschil in beleidspreferenties botst met de hogere schaalvoordelen van volledige integratie. België is natuurlijk een heel specifiek geval. Collega Beks gaf het al aan. Wij zitten in een Europese Unie die alsmaar meer federaliseert, integreert en bij elke crisis, of het nu een fiscale, een monetaire, een migratie of een bankencrisis is, men zegt altijd, ja, het zijn risico's voor de Unie, maar na elke grote crisis zien we toch een integratie van die Europese Unie, zowel op economisch als op politiek niveau. En wat zien we tegelijkertijd? Dat België inderdaad een klein land de omgekeerde beweging maakt. Dus wij zijn een land dat desintegreert, dat de voorbije 30, 40 jaar alsmaar meer bevoegdheden heeft gedecentraliseerd naar de verschillende deelstaten. En de vraag is dan natuurlijk welke kostprijs autonomie heeft ten nadele van de baten van de schaalvoordelen. En niet omgekeerd. En wat is dan het optimale evenwicht? Heeft u iets meer onderzoek gedaan naar de optimale voorwaarden die moeten vervuld zijn om de bestuurskracht maximaal te hebben? En dat kan natuurlijk gaan over schaal, bevolkingsschaal, over grootte van een land, maar waarschijnlijk ook over economische resources, waarschijnlijk ook over culturele of taalhomogeniteit of het zich affiliëren aan een bepaalde vlag, zal ik maar zeggen. Dat kunnen zowel objectieve parameters zijn als subjectieve. En wat is dan het optimale evenwicht? En tot slot had u het ook over less controversial public services, die volgens u een lagere heterogene kost en baten hebben. Wat zouden die kunnen zijn in een land als België om maximaal te decentraliseren? En daar sluit ik vooral aan met de vraag van collega Van Lauwe, die zei van ja, wat maakt eigenlijk een land tot een land? Welke federale bevoegdheden of nationale bevoegdheden zijn minimaal nodig om van een land te kunnen spreken? Mijn vraag vraagt eigenlijk het omgekeerde of is de spiegelvraag. Wat zou men maximaal kunnen delegeren, decentraliseren van less controversial public services in uw definitie? Dank u wel.
Dank u wel, collega Genet. En dan geef ik graag terug het woord aan professor Het is hier weer echo. Spolaore dus, om te antwoorden op de vragen. The floor is yours.
So thank you so much for all these questions. These are extremely interesting and intriguing questions, and I appreciate them also because they're very good also from my point of view in terms of my research, as they give me really more insights and a clear idea about what are the pressing important practical issues that the democratic institution like the Flemish Parliament is interested in. So I will try to answer as many questions as I want, and I apologize if I don't answer all the questions, and there were so many and they are very difficult. We would have to take a long time. So the first, so starting from the first question that was asked about what are the functions that have to remain within a nation or a sovereign state for that to be defined as sovereign state. I think that's a very good question. And I think that the classical definition of a sovereign state at the end is where the ultimate monopoly of legal coercion is. So who is the power, the entity that has the final power to implement and enforce the laws? So that's really sovereignty. And now I believe that in order to have sovereignty, that's why very often, as it was mentioned by the person who asked the first question, very often defense and security are associated with them. Now, this is not necessarily the case that if you are a sovereign state, you must be completely in charge of every aspect of your defense if you have a well-working military alliance, but you still should have the final say of whether you want to join or not join the alliance, or if you want to leave the alliance and join a different alliance. So this, of course, we see that this is a major issue now with Ukraine. Ukraine will not be considered a sovereign state if they cannot decide what is the military alliance that they can join. So my short answer is that to be a nation state, the important thing is to have power over what is power about one's foreign policy and defense policy, in the sense of what alliance to join or what supranational institution to join. Short of that, of course, almost anything else in principle could be delegated. It could be. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good idea to decentralize it, but it could be decentralized. But it could be decentralized if that is the will of the overwhelming majority of people. Now, here I want to answer also a separate but connected question, which is, how can we protect minorities while we are in a democracy? Now, these two things are, of course, they are not mutually exclusive in the sense that exactly because it's a full democracy, a society that is a full democracy should also have very large protection of minorities. So a majority of 50% plus one is not enough typically to define a democracy. A democracy is not a country where all the decisions are taken by 50% plus one and that's it. That would be a tyranny of the majority. That's why the fathers of the US Constitution introduced a lot of checks and balances and a lot of additional constraints so that you cannot really rule the country with just 50% plus one. And that's why, we have Supreme Courts, we have legal courts. And so it is fine. I think it's necessary to give a lot of protection to minorities, even some veto power on some essential issues, but not, of course, on everything. Of course, there is a trade-off there as well. There is a trade-off between the efficiency. If the more veto power I give to heterogeneous groups, the harder it is to find something efficient. But that's exactly why there are these heterogeneity costs. That's why if we have groups that are very, very different from each other, that they have decided jointly about a public good, that is why it becomes, more costly. But sometimes if the ideal, of course, would be that each decides about their own public good. But if the minorities are very small or they are intertwined, as one of the question was, which is also connected to this, is what happens if either I have minorities that are part of my country, but they are intertwined with my country. Or I have even two major communities, the French-speaking and the Dutch-speaking, but then I have a situation like Brussels, where the city itself is of course not completely, it has communities that are intertwined and not what a mathematician would say all connected, so that this is not a situation where I could draw a line and everybody with some preferences would stay in north and everybody with a different preferences would stay to the south. So what is the solution there? Now, in my view, this is because it's a complicated issue, but in my view, the best solution is something that I believe in many ways in Belgium has been attempted, and I would say, given the complexity of the situation, even with some success, is to make sure that if you have political borders, they are not also barriers, right? So there is a distinction between borders and barriers, which I think answer many of the questions, including some of the question about trade. So if I have a political border, it says, if I pass that border, it means that a lot of the functions and decisions are taken by different groups of voters and different governments. But if I can assure that these borders are not barriers to the interactions that are good, which are economic interactions, mobility, trade, but also ideas, exchanges of students, university, everything that allows me to have all these gains from interactions, that would be a good thing. So that's why I'm very much opposed personally to any attempt to raise barriers to trade or to prevent any kind of supranational deal that would allow countries to interact more freely with each other, because the trick is to disentangle borders from barriers. So that's part. I don't know if this would answer some of the question. Now, in my view, so now Switzerland is a good example. In fact, I was going before it was mentioned by one of the members of parliament when I was asked first what would be a good example of a federation or confederation that has been successful. I would say, Switzerland, has a long history. Of course, it was not always, roses and flowers, as we would say in Italian. It was not always beautiful. There were periods in which there were serious conflict, even within Switzerland, across the different communities. But certainly, Switzerland has reached an equilibrium where there is, it's a well-functioning heterogeneous nation state that has, but of course we all know that a lot of the secret of the success, or not so secret success, is in the extreme extent that Switzerland decides democratically and very often with very often with direct democracy, although it's not always the case that direct democracy is the solution, but especially for some issues it helps, and certainly there is a lot of autonomy. But there is also a sense of Swiss identity. It's also true that there is a sense of Swiss identity. And Swiss identity is partly due to the fact that the Swiss had to defend themselves against foreign aggression. So clearly the fact that historically they had to form a military union among themselves certainly has helped historically. Now, I wouldn't recommend that as the best way to achieve unity or solidarity, the fact of having to form a military union among oneself. So in fact, I believe that military alliances have very large economies of scale. Should be done at the supranational level. But of course, this brings in the question of, which is extremely important, which I think was raised by at least a couple of people, directly or indirectly, I think by one very explicitly and very clearly. How is this all design of autonomy and federalism at the national level linked to the European Union process of integration? And so that is this is a fascinating question that I have spent a fair amount of time, especially more recently. I mean, I know that, by the way, I also remember our meeting, some of the members of parliament when I physically was in Brussels a couple of times. Once I visited the Flemish Parliament in the beautiful building where you are, so at that time, of course, a lot of the work was, motivated by the process of, what was going on in Europe in terms of movements for secession and autonomy, but was also already very much about the process of European integration. And why was it so difficult to proceed towards fiscal and political union within the EU, while the euro had already been, the euro was introduced around, around the time, immediately before we wrote the book in the early 2000s, we were really working. We have chapters in the book about that, but more recently I wrote several articles about that. And my view is that, while I'm very much in favor of the process of European integration, and I think that it has been on balance a success, I also share the view that many people have of Europe as a half-built house. That is very often almost a cliche that is used to talk about the European Union. The European Union has a half-built house, so that some parts have been built. Like there is a common currency. There is much more than just commercial integration. There are many functions that are, at least in principle, delegated to European institutions. But in many other dimensions, there is not really, nobody believes that the European Union would, be able to be a defense union at the moment. There was an attempt to create a defense union in the 1950s, but it was vetoed by the French Parliament at the time, and it was not implemented. So why is it so? I mean, now I believe that the real problem in Europe has been the heterogeneity cost. So the very high heterogeneity costs that have not been addressed directly. So the fact that in Europe there is a very big, there are big differences about what would be the real, what would be the decision that would be taken if the European Union were really a fiscal union, or if it was really a political union making decisions about foreign policy or about defense. So there are very high heterogeneity costs. So this was understood by Jean Monnet and by the designers of the. But then the trick was to do things gradually, piecewise. So we start with the easier things, the commercial integration, where the heterogeneity costs are lower. Even the common currency is still not quite, I mean, there are high heterogeneity costs, but it's still, there are also a lot of benefits from having a common currency, and that are also due to that are linked to, rival goods, and so that where there are heterogeneity benefits. So on balance, these things could be done, while other things could not be done. But then the hope almost was, if there is a crisis, as one of the members of parliament correctly said, when there is a crisis, the answer is always more integration. Now, sometimes that is good, sometimes that is bad, because it gives a false sense of if there is a crisis, then we can have more integration, and that can solve the problem. It's not always the case that more integration is politically feasible, because it can be blocked by the very high heterogeneity cost. So in my view, and this is something that I discuss, I have some article about, this is called Jean Monnet's chain reaction. Every time that there is a crisis, we will speed up the process of integration, and we will have more integration. It works only up to a point, but we have to be careful. It would be much better at this stage to do things in a way that are more efficient and coherent, in the sense of every single step should be stable by itself and not just incomplete, not half built, so that later it will be fixed by further crisis. So I believe that there are only, so that would have eventually to be a democratic decision by the constituents of the European Union, either to bite the bullet and said there will be some major functions that have to do with sovereignty that I'm going to transfer to European institutions, and then there will be really a delegation of sovereignty to the European Union. Or they will say, no, this is still a confederation of nation states, and the ultimate sovereign states with the nation states, and the European Union is just going to coordinate. There will have to be a decision about that. At the moment, I believe most of the power is still in the hands of the nation states, which brings up, so I know there are many questions that were asked about that other aspects. So to what extent, considering that the European Union is not the institution that at this moment provides full, fiscal. It's not a full fiscal union. It doesn't provide, that is not where most of the budget comes. It's not a defense union, a full defense union. It's not a center of foreign policy. Then all these decisions are still at the level of the nation state. Up to what point can then other functions be delegated at the autonomous level? My view is, I don't have an answer, an automatic answer in every situation, because, as I said, I always believe that it very much depends on the specific preferences, and the specific preferences can be checked through the voting process. But my view is that there is a very large scope for devolution and decentralization in general. Now, I understand that there are major specific issues in Brussels that have, and two that were mentioned, I think. One is public debt, and the other is issue of solidarity. And I know that those are being, big. Now, the public debt, of course, is a major issue of how to portion there's a very, of course, Italy also has a very large public debt that has been, an issue for a long time. So in that sense, it would be, I think it's okay. It's reasonable that there should be, this decision should not be done by pure majority voting, but there should be done with super majorities. And I also agree that it's much harder to have equilibrium and stability when some of the decisions about autonomy or even independence, although that might not be the case in Belgium, have to be taken by regions that are poor on average. So what happens? So in general, it's relatively easier to reorganize state structure and institutions if when the regions involved are richer than average. It's much harder when they are in some sense, although it's harder on some other sense. It's hard, so it's easier to do. Of course, it's easier because there are more resources for side payments. It's harder for the reason that I mentioned, because it's hard to have preference-based policies. When the regions are poor, I believe sometimes there have been successful ways in which the regions have been kept within the country. One example is Canada. Canada has been kept together very often because of the ways that different regions have shared some benefits from oil or some benefits from resources and so on. So Canada, as we know, also had, there was a lot of pressure. There was also a very close call, a referendum in the 90s. So Canada, I wouldn't say that Canada is necessarily a better model than other federal states, but certainly Canada is a place where the fact that for many years Quebec was on average poorer than some other parts of Canada, this would allow for a deal that kept the country stable. But so that would be another example of, the United States is not a particularly, it's not a bad or good example in general, because it varies a lot historically. So of course, the United States had the worst civil war of, almost any country in the 19th century, but it has also been, a major economic and political superpower, and the country has, stayed together for all the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century. But we know there is a lot of political polarization at the moment in the United States. And so in that sense, I wouldn't take the United States as the best possible example of dealing with this, but certainly the fact that there was a fair amount of, decentralization in some dimension, helped to keep some stability, but not necessarily, but sometimes at the cost of equity and efficiency. So I wouldn't consider that necessarily a good model. I believe I have answered at least most of the questions, but if there is anything that I didn't really address that is pressing, please let me know.
Oké, hartelijk bedankt. Zijn er nog parlementsleden die bijkomende vragen hebben, opmerkingen, suggesties? Collega Verlauwen.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter. Dank u wel, professor. Ik hoop dat u mij verstaat, dat er terug vertaling is. Do you understand? Ja, oké. Ik heb niet echt een vraag, maar één bedenking. We wijken een klein beetje af van het thema, maar de opmerking die zowel hier gezegd is als door u ook aangehaald is, dat telkens na een crisis in de Europese Unie er eigenlijk sprake is van meer integratie in de Europese Unie. Ik ga dat niet tegenspreken, maar er zijn natuurlijk ook tegenvoorbeelden te geven. We zien natuurlijk ook dat één van de destijds 28 lidstaten, namelijk de UK, ondertussen uit de Europese Unie gestapt is. Toen er een crisis was in Griekenland, een bankencrisis, de monetaire crisis, sprak men er ook van dat er een Brexit zou gebeuren, dat Griekenland eruit zou. Dat is niet gebeurd. Maar meer politieke unie heeft er wel voor gezorgd dat een van de sterkste economieën binnen de Europese Unie er uiteindelijk uitgestapt is. De vijfde sterkste economische macht ter wereld, de UK, is uit de Europese Unie. Dus er telkens van uitgaan, ja, er is meer integratie, dat klopt. Maar tegelijkertijd verzwakt het ook die Unie, omdat er een bepaalde partner eigenlijk de club uiteindelijk verlaten heeft. Dus ik denk, het verhaal moeten we toch wel nuanceren dat iedere crisis leidt tot meer integratie. Ik weet niet of het vertrek van de UK uit de Europese Unie heeft wel gezorgd dat er... hoe moet ik het zeggen? Heeft ervoor gezorgd dat de Europese Unie wel degelijk verzwakt is geworden uit die strijd. Ook de UK uiteindelijk. Hè. Maar dat is maar een bedenking, geen vraag.
Dank u wel. Heeft er nog iemand anders een bijkomende? Collega Van Eyck?
Ja, heel kort. Dank u wel, voorzitter. Dank u wel ook, professor. U hebt niet geantwoord of ik uw boek begrepen had. Alle gekheid, ik heb eigenlijk nog één vraagje. Misschien hebt u dat toch, maar het zou me dan toch wel een beetje ontgaan zijn. Wij stellen vast dat er in sommige landen met betrekking tot bevoegdheidsverdeling, in België hebben we een vrij stringent gegeven waarbij alle gemeenschappen en gewesten over dezelfde bevoegdheden beschikken. Daarmee wil ik zeggen, we hebben 3 gemeenschappen, die hebben alle 3 dezelfde bevoegdheden. We hebben 3 gewesten, alle 3 dezelfde bevoegdheden. Maar er zijn landen, denk aan Spanje, denk aan Groot-Brittannië, waar er een verschillende dynamiek bestaat, waarbij er niet altijd een institutionele symmetrie is. Hebt u wat dat betreft ook aanbevelingen of denkt u dat dat een verdedigbare evolutie is? En anderzijds stellen wij toch ook vast, en ik denk dat België wat dat betreft atypisch is. Wij zijn eigenlijk een land, en ik heb niet heel de wereld in ogenschouw genomen, maar wij zijn eigenlijk, denk ik, een van de weinige landen waar de meerderheid meer autonomie vraagt. Terwijl ik in andere landen, Quebec is aangehaald, maar ik zie dat ook in Catalonië, ik zie dat in Welsh, ik zie dat in Schotland, waarbij het eigenlijk die minderheden zijn die meer autonomie vragen. Hebt u daar een verklaring voor?
Professor?
Thank you very much. So first, regarding the point that when there is a crisis, more integration will not necessarily solve the crisis and might even lead to disintegration, I completely agree. In fact, that was part of, I was in 2016, I was invited by the Royal Economic Society to be in a panel about Brexit right before the vote. And that was exactly the point that one of the points that I made, that was part of this what is called this functionalist dynamics in the European Union, this idea that every time there is a crisis, it could be addressed with further integration that would involve higher heterogeneity costs. That was one of the reasons why there was, that could lead in principle to a Brexit, which in my view personally was a mistake, by the way. I don't think that the UK is better off with Brexit, because I thought they had a great deal by not being in the Euro, not being in Schengen, but still being part of the European Union commercially. So personally, I don't think it was a great idea, but it was certainly something that could be expected for the reasons that were mentioned by the member of parliament, that the fact that the heterogeneity costs were very high, and there are countries clearly like Britain where the heterogeneity costs at least by a majority of the population were perceived as too high, exactly if they were to accept to stay in an institution that was going to lead to always reacting to crisis with further and further integration. So I agree that further and further integration is not necessarily a solution. Also, this gives me the opportunity to answer one question that I didn't answer before, whether if you have more and more autonomy and decentralization, that would lead to more stability or more instability. Now, even mathematically, it can be shown that the relationship is not linear or monotonic. It's not that more decentralization always leads to more stability or more instability. There is a discontinuity. More decentralization up the point leads to more stability, because then people are happy to have this decentralization, and then they would be more willing to stay in a federal state that allow them to be more decentralized. But if the heterogeneity costs are very high, this is true for intermediate levels of heterogeneity. If the heterogeneity costs are very, very high and people have very, very strong desire to live anyway, if you give them more autonomy, you also give them the means to live, and that might be efficient or not efficient, but certainly it would create a change in the borders. Now, that immediately brings up, I say that because it also links to the question that the member of parliament, Van Dijk, was asking. Oh, by the way, I should say that when you read the book, you understood the book very well. I mean, it's absolutely true that the book is about the fact that economic integration leads to certainly much less need to form, larger and, bigger units. And it's also absolutely true that flexibility is very important, to be flexible in institutional flexibility rather than rigidity, which is also why I think that in principle, it's perfectly okay to have asymmetries sometime if those are warranted by the fundamentals, as an economist would say. So we have in Italy, we have regions that have much more autonomy than other regions because of the such as the regions of Trentino and Alto Adige, which would be Südtirol in German, at the border with Germany, especially the German-speaking part of Italy had much more autonomy than Veneto, Lombardy, and so on. And Val d'Aosta has more autonomy. Sicily and Sardinia have more autonomy, and that was done partly to counter the possibility of secessions. And in fact, now to make it credible, in fact, there was a treaty also with Austria that guaranteed some rights of German-speaking minorities in Italy. So up to a point, some asymmetries, can be justified. Of course, it might lead to instability sometimes, because of course then the Lombards, the Veneti, etc., they say why we would like the same kind of autonomy, and that's part of a debate whether that would be justified or not. But now, of course, things, every time that you introduce an asymmetry or a difference in treatment, it has to be clearly justified by fundamentals and be consensual. So it's not. So that is. In a smaller country like Belgium, where there are basically 3 linguistic communities, but of course the German one is much smaller, but it's basically French and Dutch, and it would be very hard to have an asymmetry where the French are treated better or worse than the French speaking are treated better or worse than the Dutch speaking, or vice versa. Now, of course, it's possible that within each of these communities that might also be asymmetry, depending on whether you are closer or farther to Brussels or on economic situation and so on. But it would have to be done extremely carefully. And also, once you set things like that in the asymmetries in the constitution, it might be very hard to change. So sometimes it might be justifiable to introduce an asymmetry now, but then in 20 years, it might not longer be justified by the fundamentals, but it might be very hard to change. So of course, but that I mean, I know that very often this sounds, typical economist answer, on the one hand, it depends and so on. But in this case, I would say that's because that's it. But I think that's really the advantage of the economic approach, that we have 2 hands, and so we have the cost and we have the benefits. So we have the trade-offs. Now, the fact that we have 2 hands doesn't mean that one is necessarily equal to the other. Sometimes one hand is much bigger than the other. Sometimes the costs are much bigger than the benefits, and sometimes the benefits are much bigger than the cost. And the answer is straightforward. Every time there is a long, of course, when you have a gridlock and a long debate, and when it takes a long time to make decision, very often is because the 2 hands are very close to each other, or for some people, one hand is much bigger than the other, and for the other is the opposite. So there's a conflict of interest about which hand is bigger. And that there is, of course, then there is, economists cannot answer, should not. If an economist were to tell you, oh yeah, economics say that you should decentralize X, Y, and Z, but not W, that economist, is very often selling, his or her preferences to you rather than letting you make the decision, because it's not the job of the economist to decide. It's the job of the representative of the people. It's you guys, to make this decision. I can provide you but I can certainly tell you there would be huge cost to, move away from commercial integration or not to participate in international trade. And those costs, in my view, are much bigger than a lot of the benefits that people perceive. This I can tell you. But I cannot certainly tell you what are the specifics of the design of the extent of autonomy. But my view is that there is a lot of room for decentralization, especially in countries where there is a history of Napoleonic centralization, like Belgium, where in the past everything was done at the central level. So in that sense, the fact some people ask specifically about taxes and transfer. I believe to give some fiscal autonomy to regions so that they can have their own taxes and there is some fiscal competition is not a bad idea. One has to be careful because, of course, one can err on the other side, and there is in general, if the state has the monopoly of coercion, the national state, it also has to have the means to implement the laws to support the defense and security and so on. But that doesn't mean that all the taxes have to be raised at the central level. Many taxes can be raised at the local level, and in many cases that's not. But the devil is always in the detail. So the risk is obviously that then you get taxed twice and you get taxes that are too high. I mean, the big risk is overtaxing. So clearly one has for that. It's there need to be guarantees and some limitations, but that's also I think answered one of the other questions that were asked. Thanks.
Oké, dank u wel. Zijn er nog parlementsleden die een bijkomende vraag hebben? Nee, professor Spogliarelli, mag ik u dan van harte bedanken. Nog heel veel succes toewensen aan uw universiteit en ontzettend bedankt om hier aanwezig te willen zijn. Dank u wel. Collega's, kunnen jullie nog even blijven voor een kleine regeling van de werkzaamheden? Oké.